Hey, what's up, YouTube? It's Richie from Boston. It is the 15th of May in the year 2020, or at least that's what they want us to believe. Now, I never do live streams this early. I am trying to refresh my screen over here, but I've got a couple of people from across the proverbial pond, as well as Dr. Andrew Kaufman. Andrew Kaufman's going to jump in here to ask the really good questions that I would probably miss because it's too early, because I am joined by the authors of an amazing book that everybody on earth should own. David Parker and Don Lester are the authors of this incredibly well-researched book called What Really Makes You Ill, and Everything You Thought You Knew About Disease Is Wrong. Guys, I appreciate your time. I appreciate you putting up with me first thing in the morning.
No, that's fine. We're really happy to be here. So no, that's good.
Now, I told you originally before we went live that I had heard you on the Crow 777 show, and I had to get a hold of you. I had to get a hold of Andrew Kaufman as well. So Crow has opened the door to both of you guys. What made you write such an enormous book? This book is 800 pages, and it's not your opinion. You have everything cliff noted. You have all the links. You have all the information cited. What made you, what sent you down this path? Because this was very similar to writing a religious book. It's huge.
It is. We had no idea just how big it was going to be, but I have to tell you, because we've researched this book for, over 10 years, and that's why it's so big, and that's why there's 40 pages of references. We didn't start out to make it that big, but as Dawn often said, the difficulty was how much to leave out. Otherwise, it would have been at least twice this size, but we thought that was just too much for people. So it was just a labor of love, really. Once we started, we knew from various experiences of our own, particularly in my life, that there was real problems with what the medical establishment were telling us, particularly over cancer. I had, as I've said to people, various of my relatives, close relatives and friends over the years had been diagnosed with cancer, all taken the proposed treatment by the hospitals and the doctors, and they all died. But as I say, I had another relative, an elderly lady who was also diagnosed with cancer but refused to have anything to do with the medical establishment. And after a year or so, they were able to tell her cancer had gone, and she lived a long and happy life. So that was one of the first things. It was quite a sad time for me, but which really was a wake-up call as to I knew there was something wrong with the medical establishment, particularly when they were sort of bragging, really, that their expertise had improved and they were getting 50% success rates with curing cancer. And I thought, well, with the half a dozen people that I know, all died. So you've got a 100% failure rate as far as I'm concerned. So that was one of the real starting points to start looking at things. And also at the time we were writing another book, which was about the nature of reality, actually. It was nothing to do with medical systems. And there was a chapter in it where we needed to write about viruses. So we started, obviously, to investigate about viruses and realised there was all sorts of confusing and contradictory information, not least of which was around the HIV thing. Again, in the 80s, we're old enough to know all about the stuff that was going off in the 80s, particularly with a sort of outbreak of HIV/AIDS supposed pandemic that was going to destroy the world. Everyone was going to die. Whether you were homosexual or heterosexual, it was a doomsday prophecy, which of course has turned out not to be true at all. But they still diagnose people with AIDS. But so we thought, what is going off with this? So we started to look into it and realised there was lots of, again, a big controversy over it, which we were totally unaware of. But the more we looked into it, cutting a very long story short, because we spent a lot of time on it, and it is well covered in our book, and found that there was actually no virus at the bottom of it. There was no viral cause of AIDS. quite easily explainable set of symptoms regarding drugs and lifestyle of the people in San Francisco at the time where it was supposed to have started. But it was all easily explainable and nothing to do with the virus. So basically we thought, well, if they could be so wrong about this, what else are they wrong about as regards viruses? And so that's really what kicked us off. And of course we decided we'd just ask the most basic question you could ask is, well, what really makes you ill? Hence the first part of the title of the book. And we, as I'm an electrical engineer and Dawn was an accountant, so I often tell people you're too busy for that now. I still do some electrical engineering, but it's getting less and less because I don't have the time either. But we have logical minds, and we're used to doing research work, and we're used to taking not accepting the first thing we're told. We look for the evidence, and it's literally follow the evidence, and that's what we did. And we found that we could ask questions that, and all due respect to Andy, that doctors never thought to ask or were afraid to ask. But we weren't. We had no sacred cows, so we could ask any question. We didn't mind whether it made us look foolish. The basic question, well, what really makes you ill? And people thought we were foolish. Some people did. They say, well, it's obvious. We all know about germs, bacteria, and viruses. That's what makes you ill. Well, we said, well, the evidence doesn't support that. And so we went back in history to look at the germ theory, where it originated. Most people sort of attribute it to Louis Pasteur, but he did actually start before him. But as people are beginning to realise now that he plagiarised a lot of work from other people, not least of which was Anton Béchamp, who was a real scientist of that time. So we're going back about, 150 years. Anyway, he, at that time, as I often say to people, all as they had was the optical microscopes. And so they could see bacteria in the blood, and that was their first big mistake that they made, is they could see bacteria surrounding dead and dying tissues, and wrongly assumed that the bacteria were the cause of the dead and dying tissues. And so we often sort of give the little analogy that that would be akin to blaming firemen for house fires, because you always see firemen around a house fire. And what they didn't realise when they were seeing the bacteria was that the bacteria are a natural cleanup mechanism. They actually sort of eat up, if you like, decomposing matter, and you see this everywhere in nature. So they're essential to the body. Without them, there'd be no human life, no life at all, without the job that the bacteria do, not only in cleaning up toxic materials in the blood, but also in aiding our digestion. Without them, we wouldn't be able to digest food. So they're extremely important, but they made the mistake of thinking they were the enemy of the body and were attacking it. So that got developed because it was then became useful, shall we say, commercially, to develop things to kill the bacteria. And I think probably many of your listeners are familiar with how the Rockefeller family got involved with their petrochemical industry. And that's why even today most pharmaceutical drugs are based on petrochemical substances. And so it became a money-making thing. But then, of course, they couldn't blame everything that they found, all diseases, they couldn't blame everything on bacteria, so they knew there must be something else. And it wasn't until about the 1930s, when they developed the electron microscope, that they were able to see even smaller particles in the blood, which again, they made the mistake of thinking these were something else that was attacking the body, that they were sort of causing damage, causing disease. And they gave them the name of viruses, although, as we've said before, that was a corruption of the original meaning of the word virus, which comes from the Latin and means a toxin or a noxious substance. So it's a corruption of its original meaning. And they name these little particles, which are really pieces of protein. And they're not alive, which is often missed by people, particularly virologists, who make a business out of well, blaming these particles for almost anything you can think of, including the recent thing that they've scammed the world with called the coronavirus. But one of the basic things that virologists both then and now have never done is prove that these particles actually cause a disease. There are sort of several basic things that they should answer, which is, first of all, they need to isolate the virus, whichever it is they're blaming for a disease, is to isolate it, purify it, and list its genetic makeup, and actually produce a paper that proves that that virus is the sole cause of the particular disease that they're attributing to it. And that's never been done. It's never been done for this COVID-19, and it's never been done for any virus. And we've put out the challenge, and I know Dr. Kaufman has too, show us the proof. Show us where these original papers are. And other people have looked for it. The late Carrie Mullis, inventor of PCR, he looked for the papers to prove that there was a virus caused AIDS, and they're nowhere to be found. And as we've spoken about Dr. Stefan Lenker, who was a virologist, he doesn't like to be called a virologist anymore because he believes it is, quite rightly, a corrupt, well, I hesitate to use the word science because it isn't, it's just a corrupt procedure. And he knows, and he's on the record as saying neither he or any of his colleagues, his team, have been able to find any virus to be the cause of any disease, which is an extremely bold statement to come from a former virologist. And all our research upholds that, which is astounding, absolutely astounding when you consider the amount of diseases that are blamed on viruses. And even more astounding when you realize this whole pandemonium that's going off at the moment that has shut down the world by the authorities is not based on any sound science at all.
David, let me back you up. All right, somebody's got their watch page open. Someone's watching this on YouTube with their volume not muted. I'm looking at you, Andrew. You got your mic muted now. Let me ask you then. You mentioned something that this virus, even the one that's going around right now, according to the mainstream media, has yet to be proven. So how can they make a vaccine?
Well, exactly. That's an excellent question. How on earth can you make a vaccine on something that's never been proved to actually exist or do something? And it's a complete farce. I mean, even in their own terms, they say that, to produce a vaccine, would take 5 years at least. And then they've just kept bringing that down. We've got Bill Gates then saying, oh, well, we could probably do it in 18 months, but we need the governments to give us immunity. Should be a warning bell there somewhere. And the time scale just keeps coming down and down. I mean, we've got the British government testing a vaccine now, so they've managed to do it in just a few weeks. It's just nonsense, absolute nonsense. But the scary thing is what the hell is going to be in this thing, that they're going to want to start pumping into people's blood system. It's really not good news at all.
Well, I don't know if you've seen this, but I show this to Dr. Kaufman. Let me pull this up on the screen, and Andy, you can talk about this. This just popped up. Where is this? Stand by. Here it is. Because why wait 5 years when you can just do this now? This has the RFID tags enabled, GPS mobile tracking, everything you need in an easy-to-use, family-sized dosage. And they're already recommending, to make sure you're definitely immune to it, that they'll give it to you twice. What's better than that?
Well, if I could chime in here, like one thing I just want to say that the way that Don and David approach this, right, as being interested individuals wanting to look into things a little bit further. I think that is really, really important. And that's what I've been trying to encourage people to do, is to realize that if you take the time and look at things yourself, you can actually come to a point of understanding. And I think it's actually quite a big advantage to not be from within the system. Right? Like, I know that my credentials kind of give me some ability to talk about this material and understand it. But if you come from an outside perspective, you're not beholden to any of the dogma or the principles that you are if you come up educated in the system. So it gives you a freedom to see a bigger perspective. And I think that you're much more likely to see bigger truths from that perspective. So it's really important, the work that they've done in this book. And, David, I absolutely agree with you about how the whole virus thing came about. And, early on, when the scientists, they were already expecting to find some kind of virus, particle or organism before the microscope was invented, because they basically had this idea that these diseases were caused by a virus because they didn't see bacteria to explain it. And when they started looking, they had this problem that when they were looking at the damaged tissue, that there were all these different kinds of debris and particles from the damaged cells, and they really couldn't tell what was what. And they didn't recognize anything that looked like the viruses that they had seen in bacteria, which they call bacteriophages, because those have a specific geometrical structure, and they can be purified. And you look under the microscope and you see all these particles that they look identical. When they were looking at diseased tissue from humans that they suspected was caused by a virus, they saw heterogeneous particles of all different shapes and sizes. And so they basically were about to give up completely on finding a virus until this famous paper came out by Enders with a new method of doing this research. But what they didn't realize is that this new method was really invalid and had no negative control to show that it was valid. But what they did is they mixed bodily fluid or tissue from a sick individual with a cell culture in the laboratory that had been stressed by not giving it adequate nutrition. And then they added antibiotics to the mix that were toxic to the cells. They then incubated this mixture for a period of days and saw the cells basically becoming damaged and decaying and putting out all of these particles. And they said that that was damage due to the virus, without taking into account that that damage would have occurred without that body fluid sample anyway, because they basically didn't properly give the nutrients, and then they added the toxic antibiotics to the cell culture. So once they interpret this as being damage from the virus and people accepted it, this procedure just perpetuated itself down the road, and all the studies to this day are done using that method. And there never once did they do a control experiment where they have the same tissue culture and the same antibiotics, but without the sample that they say contains a virus. And so Stefan Lanka, who you mentioned, he actually hired an independent laboratory to do this experiment for the measles virus, and found that he could see the same exact particles without adding the sample from the sick person with measles. And so that's the only time I know that this negative control experiment has been done. But essentially what you're saying is they have a faulty procedure, and they have used this procedure over and over again to claim that viruses exist when it really doesn't show anything at all.
One of the things they don't take account of is, like you say, the procedures for actually looking at something under a microscope in the first place. They use antibiotics, but they also use staining materials, dyes, fixatives, and who knows what kind of effects they have, but they're never taken into account.
And so what we found, and particularly we often mentioned Dr. Harold Hillman, no longer with us, unfortunately, but he was a cell biologist and studied cell biology for over 40 years. And, he came to the conclusion with the methods that virologists use in particular, that they create artifacts. These are things that basically don't have an existence in real life. They're things they create within their petri dishes, and they have no bearing on what's happening in the human body. But then they build a whole load of false assumptions on those artifacts, and hence virology perpetuates itself, and the rest of humanity suffers from their erroneous assumptions.
So, Richie, are you muted?
I'm an idiot. At any rate, just real quick, if you had to do this all over again, knowing that this entire episode that blew up in 2020, how would you rewrite your book, if at all?
Well, we wouldn't. I mean, as I say, we wrote the book before this nonsense hit the world, and so there's it's sort of fortuitous for us, really, that as we release the book, this nonsense hit the world, and there's nothing that changes what we've said. So no, everything is exactly as we've said it, and it shows that there are no viruses that are pathogens, or bacteria for that matter. So it's no different for all the ones that have preceded this COVID-19. It's exactly the same. It's a nonsense that's not built on any sound scientific principles at all.
It's just that there was something I noticed the other day that we'd written, which actually pertains to this. Yes, I'll bear with me a tick. I'll find it.
We can talk among ourselves for a moment.
Yes, no, it's just
Well, this brings up a really important consideration, because Richie, you brought up things about the vaccine. But if there's no viruses that cause disease, right, then what are these vaccines for? They must be for another purpose, because they can't prevent us from getting a disease by an imaginary virus that doesn't exist. So, if we look at most of the technology for these vaccines that they have been able to develop in record time, almost as if they had the plans beforehand to develop the technology. It's using a different type of procedure than the vaccines that we are normally used to. In those vaccines, they would have, a piece of an alleged virus or an inactivated virus that it would basically supposed to ignite our immune system to developing antibodies to it. But with this new vaccine, what they're doing is not that. They want to inject a piece of DNA into us and use this special procedure called electroporation, where there are extra needles that apply a current to your muscle tissue under the skin, and it creates these little pores or holes in the cells. And those allow the free DNA to get inside the cell. And then the idea is for our cells to make this DNA with a foreign protein gene product. And they tell us it's a protein from the SARS-CoV-2 virus. And then we're supposed to have our own cells make that, and then somehow alert our immune system that that's a foreign invader and it should develop immunity against it. I don't really see exactly how this is possible, because our immune system recognizes our own cells, and it would be weird if our own cells have this foreign protein. I'm not sure how it's gonna go, but one thing you could see is, would it allow for our immune cells to somehow recognize our own cells as other and not want them to be around? That's definitely a concern. But since there's no virus to take a gene from, I really wonder what genes they're going to put in here, because this is essentially the procedure to make a genetically modified organism. So they want to turn us into some kind of GMO organism with an unknown gene.
Dawn, did you find what you were looking for?
Yes, I did. It was just a sentence. I know it's sort of slightly off topic from what Andy was saying, but we actually wrote, widespread public knowledge that viruses are non-living particles that are inert outside of the host cell would make it a great deal more difficult for the medical establishment to justify their claims that these particles are dangerous and cause many deadly diseases. So we almost kind of...
We wrote that quite a few years ago in the process of putting the book together, and
that's exactly what they're trying to do.
It's turned out to be quite prophetic, really.
They're trying to claim that that's what viruses do, but of course that, you know, they don't want people to know that they're not living, they're not alive, they don't cause disease.
And of course, as people will realise, you know, take away the germ theory, and the whole of the medical establishment falls down. It's a house of cards,
including the vaccine industry, particularly.
Yeah, I mean, we can talk about vaccines. I know Andy was sort of mentioning them there. I mean, yeah, it's quite scary what they may be putting in this new one. But again, vaccines is a corrupt science, and I say that in inverted commas. Vaccines have never been proven to confer immunity for anything, and there have been many books written about it right from the sort of advent of vaccines, and we quote many of them in our book. There is no science behind it. I mean, they all rely on the fact that that the body has this thing that we often call an immune system, but the body doesn't work that way. It's we try to use a different word and call it a health system. The body has a health system. It doesn't have an immune system that you can boost up by giving it various things, least of all vaccines, you know. So you can't vaccinate someone, inject something into their body that will then promote immunity to that disease in the future. It's totally unfounded. There is no science to prove that that happens, but there is plenty of evidence to show that vaccines cause a great deal of damage to people, not only in giving them ill health, but you know, lots of people have died through vaccination, and there are many cases cited, and we put some in our book. So again, it's a very corrupted piece of technology that the medical establishment use, and it's a very dangerous piece of technology, again, not based on science. But of course, they all sort of go hand in glove, don't they? You know, if they can get people to believe in viruses and bacteria, and that the medical establishment can give you stuff to kill these things or to prevent you from being attacked by these things, then the whole industry supports itself. And certain people make absolute billions out of it. And obviously, if they get away with producing this new piece of toxic material that they want to inject into people, someone's going to make billions out of that as well. But it's going to be to the detriment of humanity.
Because they want to vaccinate everybody.
Yeah,
I mean, the entire world population.
I mean, we've all heard what Bill Gates has been saying, you know, who's got lots of money invested in this. But it's not about making money for these people. You know, the people who are behind all this, you know, if we're going to get a bit more political now, the people that are behind all this, they don't need the money. You know, they're super rich people.
I'm right on you with that. People keep saying this is so that they can control they've stolen all the resources, all the things of value on earth. They own or have the title to, whether people want to believe that or not.
Yeah,
but before I forget, let me ask you, because I've never spoken to anybody that's as well researched other than some other medical doctors. When you were researching this book, did you ever think you'd come across a vaccine that was literally going to have an RFID chip or some sort of a contact tracing component to it? Because that's what we're looking at right now.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's sort of you're sort of a thing of nightmares, isn't it, really, what they're doing? And I mean that exactly. You know, for anyone who understands the dangers of vaccines, just the normal toxic substances that they use, you know, what they're planning, it is a thing of nightmares. And I have to say, I mean, I'm a very optimistic person, but I'm very worried about this situation, because the majority of people are walking straight into it. You know, they're going to embrace it with open arms, and that's really scary.
You know,
Dr. Kaufman, can you hit on that same question too? I mean, did you ever think in your medical career that someone would find it acceptable to give you a vaccine for something you don't even know what it is, but you do happen to know that there's a contact tracing apparatus to it, which makes no sense other than surveillance and control?
Yeah, well, I definitely knew that there was going to be these kind of biometric surveillance technologies coming. I didn't necessarily see it paired with a vaccine, but, you know, I wanted to bring up that there's a very special situation for vaccine manufacturers, and this was created by a federal law that basically allows them to have zero product liability for the vaccines. So in other words, normally with any product that you manufacture, right, if it causes harm to an individual, right, an injury or death for any reason, then you can be sued in a court and held liable and have to demonstrate that your product is safe. With vaccines, that has, in the United States anyway, you cannot sue a vaccine company if you get harmed by their vaccine product. Instead, the government has set up a special secret court that's sealed and has a limited budget, and it's paid out billions of dollars already. But most people don't even know about it. So essentially, the government, meaning we, the taxpayers, are assuming all the liability for the vaccine manufacturers. So this is really important, not necessarily for the financial reason, as we're pointing out, right? Because these companies are so wealthy already. But what it does is it gives them full carte blanche to put anything harmful in a vaccine that they want, and then they would have no responsibility whatsoever for it. And even though this law is already on the books, they actually had a special law for the COVID-19 vaccine. And the reason for that is probably because it's really going to be considered an experimental vaccine. In other words, it will not have enough evidence to get full approval, and it will be given under some kind of emergency or experimental conditions. And this is why the timeline keeps getting shorter. You know, normally it takes years to develop a vaccine and then years to test it. And you heard President Trump saying that it's going to be, 12 months. I think that's the shortest I've heard anyone predict. Lots of people were saying 18 months, but that's way too little time to fully develop and fully test a new therapeutic agent. So I think we're going to be getting an experimental vaccine. And it's I totally agree. This is the stuff of nightmares.
So we can only surmise really that, as I say, that vaccines don't do anything beneficial, and that viruses are not pathogens. Then there's another reason for what they've done, and I think it becomes quite obvious to us, or to anyone who sort of thinks about it for a little while. It's about a power grab. It's about control of people. Which is, of course, these people who are the puppet masters behind the scenes. That's their greatest fear, as people have often sort of quipped, really. There's more of us than there is of them. And so that's a big scare to them, so that with all the money in the world, which they have, unfortunately, they need to control the people. And it's a scary thing to say, but that's the only thing that makes any sense as to what's behind this. It's about control of people. It's nothing to do with anything else. As we've already said, they don't need the money and they have all the resources. So it's got to be about the control of people.
This, either whoever is more comfortable answering this, or you guys can answer it jointly, whatever. The big thing that keeps coming up, that if viruses are dead, they're not something that can be spread airborne, etc. How do you account for the Spanish flu? I know both of you have touched on this before, but would you mind hitting on this now? All three of you. I'll make sure and I'll go away.
Okay, I'll let Dawn have a go at this one. We do cover it in the book, but Dawn's just written an article we were asked to do for someone else. I'll let you give you the potted version of it.
Well, yes, the article actually is on our website. A lot of people say that it was caused by vaccination, and certainly vaccines played a fairly major part, including in the army camps, because there were a number of records where the soldiers were receiving multiple vaccines and were either very ill or died soon afterwards. The army camp, the hospitals were full of patients really ill. But it's not the only cause, because we had a look at not just in America and Europe. We discovered that, in fact, it's reported that India suffered the greatest number of deaths from this 1918 flu, Spanish flu. And we thought, well, how does that work? Well, we always ask the question, well, what caused that? Now, they would have been vaccinated, but most of the Indian soldiers would have been fighting in Europe. So they were out of their normal kind of warm temperatures. So they'd have been subject to being, in wet, horrible trenches and suffering all of that. But they claimed to have carried the deadly disease, the viruses, back when they returned home after the war. And that, of course, doesn't make any sense, because this deadly disease is supposed to have attacked and killed people within hours or days, and the journeys back from Europe back to India would have been a lot longer. So that certainly wasn't the case. They couldn't have been carrying any kind of germs back with them. And one of the interesting things we discovered was that there had been a particularly strong ENSO, that's the El Nino Southern Oscillation, during the 1918-1919, and what that does is affect the rainfall, and there was a very, very low rainfall. And they didn't have the monsoon, so the food supply, the agriculture was severely affected, and so that would have caused a great deal of illness and suffering. And in the same way that they're doing now, we found a reasonable amount of evidence that a lot of other illnesses are just being labelled under that 1918 influenza so-called pandemic. So they just and anybody that died during that period is all seems to be moved and labelled under influenza, when of course it clearly couldn't have been so.
I mean, we find, as Dawn said,
that's a potty version.
We're seeing this now, and I know Andy's talked about it. People can die in hospital from anything you'd like to mention, and it's immediately classed as COVID. So we know that these are false figures, and I have friends, African friends, and a similar sort of story happens in Africa, where people get ill or even die, and but there it's called malaria. In the UK, someone gets ill with these symptoms, and before the COVID thing, then it was you got the flu. So and so these things, no one is actually tested for these viruses. If you go to your doctor, let's look in pre-COVID times. Someone goes in and they've got the runny nose, the bad throat, and the coughs and sneezes, and the doctor will say, "Oh, you've probably got a dose of the flu. Go home, keep rest, drink water, and all the rest of it for a couple of weeks. You've got the flu." But there's never any test done. There's no one thinks, "Oh, well, we better test you for the flu virus." It's just assumed. And in Africa, as I've just said, I know from talking to my African friends, it's the same there. When someone gets these symptoms, which are all very similar, and they just assume because it's Africa and it's a malarial area, well, I've got a touch of malaria. But no one ever tests them for it, if there could be such a reliable test. So depending on where you are and what the flavour of the month is, if you like, and in 1918 it was influenza. But one of the things that we looked at as well around the world, the reports of the amount of deaths from this thing can vary anywhere between 10, 20 million, 100 million. Well, the sort of disparity in those figures starts to tell you, well, there's nothing very scientific about how this information is being collated. And of course, we've got sort of similar things happening now with the supposed deaths from the coronavirus. They're not to be believed, and just deaths get lumped into it, which had nothing to do with the disease, even if it existed. So very highly suspicious, and there always has been. And again, no true scientific evidence to support the claims.
And just as a side note, we do actually, we did look into and research malaria, and have a fairly large section in the book that discusses it and kind of really seriously questions what causes it, and the idea that it's caused by a parasite is again highly questionable. So
I mean, one of the questions to ask, because it's quite an interesting point really with malaria, is the malarial mosquito lives on every continent in the world apart from Antarctica. So it's the same mosquito. So you have to say, well, if it's the malaria mosquito lives everywhere, why isn't there malaria everywhere? But there isn't. And then people, or the medical establishment, will try and say, oh, well, it only works in the tropical areas. But that's not true. I mean, it's not that many years ago that malaria existed in the UK, and that's hardly a tropical area. And they had cases of malaria when there was the sort of mini ice age the sort of 1300s. So it's nonsense. The sort of excuses that get put up by the authorities just don't stack up at all. There's quite a big chapter in the book about malaria and what its possible real causes are, which are nothing to do with a mosquito. Having many years ago lived in Africa myself and became very ill at that time. And I was told I'd got malaria, and everyone thought I was going to die, including me, which was quite a scary position. But I didn't know what I know now, and I know it was nothing to do with malaria. The stuff we were being given, we were being told to take double the doses and all the rest of it. But obviously it didn't do any good, according to the authorities. But now I realise that with the cocktail of vaccinations that I was given before I went out to Africa, and it was a real cocktail, some of the most nasty things you could possibly think of, it's more likely that I was seriously ill from that cocktail of vaccinations than from any mosquito. So anyway, and our research now has sort of convinced me of that, But anyway, I did survive, obviously, so that was a good thing.
One of the other things, and I noticed a comment was made about the introduction of radar around the beginning of the 20th century. So that was obviously another contributory factor, but David's kind of covered that.
Yeah,
with his background.
Yes, obviously, as an electrical engineer, sort of electromagnetic frequencies is something that's intrigued me a lot because I have to deal with them. But in our book, we talk about four factors that are sort of the source of, as we've found, are the source of all illnesses. Choose what names the establishment want to put on them, and one of them is electromagnetic frequencies. And I know people are very worried at the moment, and rightly so, with the sort of advent of and rollout of 5G. But I think in a way, it's masking what I think is a more serious problem with electromagnetic radiation, and that is with the massive amount of satellites that have been launched this year, many of them. If we look at our friend Elon Musk, he's got licenses to launch, would you believe, over 20,000 satellites this year. And he's applied for licensing to launch up to 40,000 satellites. You'd wonder how he could get that many into space, but he's already started. And, because he's got his SpaceX, which is his space agency. So he's launching his own satellites. Now, as I say, I know that this year so far he's put at least 60 up. And he's planning to put his rockets up sort of every 2 weeks, launching them in at least amounts of 60 at a time. Now, what their plan is to, and they're in low orbit, so these things are only 200 miles above your head, which might sound a lot, but it's not really in sort of space terms. That's very close. And these things are emitting, because it's all telecommunication stuff, so they're emitting microwaves. And so there won't be a single spot on the Earth that's free from being irradiated with these things. And by the time he's got 40,000 of them up there, I should think the night sky will look very different. Astronomers are already complaining about it because they can't take decent pictures of planets because these things are whizzing by all the time and are spoiling their photographs. Well, I think that's the least of their worries. Certainly for life on Earth, it's I think it's going to outweigh anything that is going to be from sort of a little antenna that's going to appear on a lamppost near your house. Yes, to be concerned with, but I think the greater concern is this massive, and someone's likened it to microwave rain, which is going to be literally raining down on us 24/7 in every spot on Earth. And I think from what I've seen, there are people starting to, particularly people who are electromagnetic sensitive, some people more sensitive than others, and it's already starting to cause illness. And from research that we've been doing, there is an excellent book out called The Invisible Rainbow, I think it is, written by an electrical engineer. And it outlays a lot of cases where ever since, let's say 1901, when Marconi made his first long-distance radio broadcast, as the outlay of telecommunications has grown since that time. There's noticeable changes in the in human illnesses and insects, birds, and even vegetation. Yeah, I see you've got the book up there. An excellent book. And it's really quite concerning. I mean, there's lots of cases, and they're in that book, which shows how forests, deforestation in certain areas of the world is being caused by electromagnetic radiation. But it's very conveniently being blamed on global warming, which is it's a distraction. It's nothing to do with it. I mean, there's the USA put in a massive radar installation in Brazil, and it's been shown that it was put in purportedly to detect smugglers and but it's killing large areas of the rainforest, but people are blaming it on where they can. The officialdom is they're blaming it on global warming, but it's not. It's this really powerful radar station which is beaming across and killing vegetation. And this is not just me making stuff up. There's been some really good scientific evidence by professionals, engineers, as well as scientists, that can show lots of cases, and they are in that book that you put up. I mean, we do talk about it in our book too, but that particular book, The Invisible Rainbow, is dedicated specifically to it, and it shows case after case after case, and some of the most unlikely things you'd think of happened with the way it affects birds. As in America, there's lots of cases where there was lots of, I think you call them the same over there, pigeon fanciers who race pigeons, homing pigeons, and they started to notice that they were losing more and more of their birds. They never came back. Whereas there was a situation where they could release, 200 birds, and they'd all come back. And they slowly started to lose more and more until they were actually in a situation where they were losing 70 to 80% of their birds, which is incredible. Anyway, again, to cut a long story short, they found out that wherever they were their birds were having to fly through zones of telecommunication masts, this is what was doing it. It affects their homing radar, if you like, for the birds, and they get lost. And the same thing has been shown for bees. Beekeepers were losing their hives. And again, the establishment tried to blame it on a virus. And again, we looked into the cases of this, and those were totally unproven. And again, lots of experiments have been shown that, again, it's telecommunications. The bees have homing, their own built-in radar systems, which are destroyed by these telecommunications. But it goes much deeper than that. Not only can the bees not find their way back to the hive, so they can't come back to feed the queen bee, who then starves to death, and so a whole hive goes down. And this has happened all over the world. There's lots of cases of this. And there were some very interesting experiments done in Japan and other countries where they just did simple things like took a cell phone and put it under a beehive, and the hive was soon lost. The bees didn't come back, and the hive was destroyed. So the electromagnetic frequencies are not so much talked about as to just what their long-range damage is, because it's to everything. It's not only to human life, and we talk about in our book how a lot of so-called autoimmune diseases can be attributed to electromagnetic radiation. But as from what potted version I'm just giving you, it's affecting everything, flora and fauna, our rainforests, everything. And with the advent of these literally thousands of satellites which are going up through the course of this year, because it's not only Elon Musk, Amazon are putting them up, Google are putting them up, Facebook are putting them up, not as many as him, but there's still lots, they're in the hundreds. The increase in electromagnetic radiation from just above our heads is extremely worrying, and I think it's going to cause widespread damage to the whole planet and everything on it.
Okay. I've been covering it for years. All right, somebody's got their. You're killing me. I've been covering for years how 50% of the bees are gone. 75% of the insects are gone. Birds are falling from the skies. This has been going on for time immemorial. Well, not time immemorial. It's been going on for at least 7 years that I can attest to. But speaking about Elon Musk, myself and another YouTuber, Mike Decker, we were out in Wyoming a couple of months ago or a month ago or something. And we saw SpaceX go over not once, but twice the Starlink setup. And it took 35 minutes. It was massive. When astronomers were originally quoted to saying that this was going to, screw up the night sky, we'd be able to get pictures, I'm thinking to myself, that's ridiculous. How big the sky is, the stars, etc., until I've actually seen it. Mm-hmm. And since we saw it go over not once but twice over the same location in a week's time, Elon recently was reported to launch 60 more of these things. So this is insane. Like, whoever voted for this, it's amazing how the elites have just taken such a large hand at everything, and people just keep, clicking away. Well, something else is in outer space. That's fine. Oh, the bees are dying. We'll get more. Walmart's patenting drone bees. We'll be fine. Everything's good to go. And even in the middle of this entire thing, people, with all the time that's passed since the beginning of this until now, and we're still not seeing a pandemic anywhere, you'd think people would have taken the time to research because it was up there. The Google they left it up there for a good month. They just started taking information down now, and that's going to continue. But Dr. Kaufman, I know you got something right here. I didn't mean to jump in on you, right? But if you don't, one of the questions was, how does the seasonal flu? I already know the answer to that, but if either one of you guys want to touch on that, have at it.
Yeah, I'd be happy to touch on that. I just wanted to add that, our bodies are electrical machines in a sense, right? And we know this because we have EKGs and we have EEGs, right? So we look at the electrical waves that are generated by our body, but we don't really take into account that actually all of the processes that are going on in our body have electrical and magnetic counterparts. Right. So we tend to look at it as just chemical reactions, but many of these chemical reactions actually have electrical properties, and every membrane in our body has to have a certain voltage to it. Otherwise, it can't function properly. So it's really naive to think that if we expose our body to all sorts of unnatural types of electric and magnetic fields, that it's not going to have an impact. But we're essentially behaving as if there is no impact, and that our bodies, are not really having these electrical and magnetic properties. So this is definitely going to get us into a lot of trouble. And Richie, remind me of your question again.
One of the comments that kept
flu, yeah.
Yeah, the seasonal flu. I already know the answer, but you guys can probably say it a little bit more eloquently than I. So have at it.
Yeah, sure. So, one thing to just say is that because the germ theory has been accepted without proof, all of the research into things like the flu are based around the germ theory. Stating that it's caused by a virus. And it's really important to point out, because many people may not know this, that all of the tests that they have, right, because there is a flu test that they do use sometimes in the United States only for the purpose of being able to justify a prescription for an antiviral drug. And they have tests for many other viruses, but not one of these tests measures a virus directly. They all measure other markers that have not really been compared to measuring the virus. So many of the tests are antibody tests. So they're very inaccurate and really don't mean anything. So beware, and I thought this was awfully weird when I was in medical school, because, if there was a bacterial problem, you could get a sample and do a bacterial culture and then identify the exact species of bacteria that's present. And while that may not show that it causes the disease, at least it matches a bacteria to a disease. So you could see maybe that's the right kind of bacteria to clean up that particular problem. But with virus tests, I remember the first time, we should get a virus culture, right? So we can actually show that the virus is present there. But there is no such test. And I was just told that, it's too difficult to perform. And that was the reason why it's not used that way. So it's really quite interesting. So the real cause of the influenza, you would not be able to find research articles describing an experiment to prove this, because no effort has been paid to this kind of research. But you can look in traditional medicine systems, like in Chinese medicine or Ayurvedic medicine or others, and can find various explanations for things like this. And interestingly, in traditional Chinese medicine and Ayurvedic medicine, which is Indian, they had no theory about contagion. Like, they didn't believe that people pass illnesses back and forth between each other. And, we've grown up with germ theory, and we've grown up with that belief. But it's interesting that other cultures who have observed the same phenomena of, sometimes people getting sick at the same time, but have a different explanation. So what I think the flu and colds is basically part of an annual renewal cycle. That most systems in our bodies work on a cyclical basis, right? Like, we're familiar with night and day cycles. And it's even been shown that our individual organs have their own kind of clock mechanism where they can define cycles. And we have seasonal cycles, right? And we see this in all kinds of organisms, right? Especially in the plant world, that the physiology and it changes over the seasons. So we breathe through our upper airway, our nose, mouth, throat, and lungs all year long. And in the air we breathe, there are all types of particles and pollutants that get into our system. And many of these are actually manufactured by us and didn't exist in the natural world in the past. And I think that's why we probably have more of these illnesses today than we may have had 500 years ago. But since all of these particulates and contaminants from air pollution and other sources are basically go through this whole airway system, and we have all these things to filter them out, like there's little hairs inside of our nose, there's like waves of bone that increase the surface area. And the purpose is to clean all these things out of the air before it gets into your lungs, so you can have good gas exchange and these things don't enter the inside of your body. But over the course of a year, there's damage to these tissues as a result of this process of filtering. And just think about, other types of filters that we have to change the filter, over a period of time because it reaches its capacity. So essentially what we're having is a filter change in our upper airway. And so the tissue starts to slough off, and that generates a response from our immune system, and it calls on the bacteria to come and clean up the tissues and do their recycling. And that's when we experience the symptoms, because that causes inflammation, so that there could be more blood flow to the area to clear away the debris. And it causes secretions, which clear those toxins and debris out of our body. And essentially that's what a flu is. And it happens on a seasonal basis because we have seasonal cycles, and maybe it makes sense for it to occur in the fall and winter. And I think the reason why sometimes people might get it at the same time is basically because when you're around someone and you experience their experience, then it might cause your body to start that program of annual renewal. And then you'll go through that process. And once that process goes to completion, essentially all of the tissues inside your upper airway have now been renewed and replaced and are ready to keep doing their job.
Yeah, I think there's another couple of things to come out of all that, and that is because in our research we found, particularly with things as you say, Rishi, about seasonal things that seem to appear around certain times of the year, and we looked into and suggest if you look into what's actually happening in your area at that particular time. And quite often it may be in a period, and particularly if you're in farming areas, that's when they start to spray the fields, either with the fertilizers or pesticides or herbicides. So have a look what's excuse me.
Oh my, stand by.
So yeah,
there we go.
Is to have a look what's going off in your area, and you may find, as we did, that's actually causing what the authorities are causing a seasonal disease, And many years ago, when polio was sort of rife, when we investigated that, we found that, sure enough, in those particular times, lots of DDT spraying. I mean, I know DDT is banned in most places now because it's extremely toxic, but at those times it was sprayed around as an insecticide and was sort of purported to be good for you. You know, they spray people with it as well. So highly surprising then that you get large numbers of people becoming very ill. So it's quite important to have a look what's happening in your area. Once you know that it's nothing to do with a germ, then you know it's something else. It's a case of investigating what that is. But the other thing to remember as well, and alluding to what Andy was saying, is for most people, when they get those, what we refer to as cold symptoms, you know, you're sort of getting extra catarrh, maybe sore throat, headaches, it's invariably the body going through a detox system. Those are sort of natural symptoms for when your body's detoxing. But I have to say that if you've got a healthy body, because your body detoxes naturally all the time, it's only if you get a build-up of toxins that then you get the more extreme detoxification symptoms, because the body is trying to use all of its systems, including the mucous membranes, to try and get the toxins out of your system.
And that's another reason for a fever. It raises the body's temperature, so you know you're sweating, and that's another way of releasing toxins through the skin.
Yeah, so sort of rashes and boils and blisters and associated that get associated with various diseases. They're not. There's, as we point out in the book, there's not lots of different diseases. There's just lots of different symptoms. The basic causes are the same, which we've boiled down to these 4 things, which we talk about in the book. And all of them work through the mechanism of free radicals in the body. The body produces free radicals naturally on a daily basis, just being alive, but they're cleared out through the body naturally, providing you look after your body properly, that you eat with your nutritional intake of nutrients and vitamins and minerals, antioxidants basically. The more colourful your food is and fresher it is, the more antioxidants there are in it. And your body will act normally to, the antioxidants will clear out the free radicals. But if they're left to their own devices, the free radicals that is, they will attack tissue, they damage tissue. So that it is important that they are cleared out. But if you do get an excess of these and your body's trying to detox, you'll have what people refer to as a cold, these cold symptoms. But it's not because you've caught a virus, it's your body detoxing. So people need to understand what their body's doing and what their body's telling them. It's a natural process. But as I say, we talk about that in a lot more detail in the book. Forgive me if I keep saying that, but it's an 800-page book, and we can't explain it all in.
Very intense book. It's large. I'm only on chapter 1. I only got it 2 days ago, but I'm still on chapter 1 because I've reread paragraph after paragraph because of all the barium, strontium, aluminum, etc., genetically modified food, fluoride that I've ingested over the years. I have to read things more than once to comprehend. But speaking on what you said, I didn't realize this. When you said when people are sick, seasonal, etc., look what's happening in your environment. Just recently traveling across the country, out in Wyoming, out in the West, watching them burning the fields is amazing because it's a daily thing. And the smoke going up in the sky is clearly chemical burn. It's white smoke because everybody's dumping Monsanto fertilizer, weed killer, etc., and then they burn it off and everybody ingests it, and it's a real problem. I didn't realize that. We don't necessarily have that on the East Coast.
Yeah,
but Middle America and out West, it's rampant. It's absolutely rampant.
Yeah, and it can explain a lot. You know, look what's happening in your environment, and that's without mentioning things like geoengineering, chemtrails. You know, I mean, what is being sprayed out of those things? You know. It's not good stuff, you know, and I know a lot of people think it's just a conspiracy theory, but, you know.
No, not here, they don't.
Now, anyone who knows about jet engines will know that what's happening out of those engines is not natural. So they're spraying something, and you can bet your life it's not good for the people.
You remember the old days before massive propaganda when NASA actually gave us the Appleman chart, and you could actually look up how a jet turbine engine from Rolls-Royce, Pratt & Whitney, GE worked. It expels nothing.
Yeah.
That's part of the jet turbine process. These days, they leave them from horizon to horizon.
Yeah.
I'll tell you what, during this 2020 pandemic, the chemtrailing has been a minimal, but yesterday here in Massachusetts, it was insane how badly they sprayed. They blocked the sun right out like that, but I digress.
Well, we noticed the same thing, that there was hardly anything spraying in the sky at all during the first parts of the lockdown. And then as it's been eased off, then sure enough, they're back again, and that might be connected to what they think is going to be a second wave. Well, yeah, if you're going to spray people with poison, what do you expect? But
they're going to have symptoms.
They're going to have symptoms, aren't they? Yeah. So, it's a real thing. And, if people watch the skies closely enough, they'll see some jet planes in similar sorts of heights with quite clean exhausts. There's nothing coming from the back of them. And that's how it should be. And then you'll get these others come over, again, as much as you can estimate, at the same height, at the same time, and they're puthering, these thick trails out of the back of them that not only last for hours from horizon to horizon, but they slowly spread out widthways and form artificial cloud, which can be quite thick and blocks out the sun. There's nothing natural about that, and you don't need to be, shall we say, a rocket scientist to realize that there's something very wrong with what's happening.
I say that quite often, actually, so I find that humorous. Dr. Kaufman, can you see this comment?
Do I believe there are contagious bacterial diseases?
You want to jump on that real quick? Because that's come through quite a few times.
Yeah, sure. So we haven't talked a lot about bacterial diseases, but also there's really no evidence that bacteria cause diseases either, which we haven't talked about at length. So I'll tell you how bacteria can be involved in being sick is essentially when bacteria eat dead tissue, they generate toxic materials. And so this is really what food poisoning is about, right? Because when you have spoiled food that starts to rot and the bacteria grow on it, they can create some toxins in that process. And if you are exposed to those toxins, they can make you sick, right? Just like food poisoning and cholera are essentially illnesses like that. But bacteria do not invade your body and cause disease. The other times that bacteria can be involved in disease would be when the terrain in your body is seriously disrupted. For example, after you take antibiotics, that what can happen is that the bacteria already in your body that are exposed to those antibiotics go through a change in order to survive. And sometimes that change makes them behave in certain ways that can be destructive. And so one example that is pretty well known to people there is called C. diff or pseudomembranous colitis. And this is a nasty kind of condition that you can have after taking antibiotics where essentially the inside of your colon starts sloughing off and you get bad diarrhea, and it can even be fatal. But interestingly, the treatment that seems to be effective for it is not more antibiotics, but something like a fecal transplant, where you're actually giving back the normal bacteria from a healthy person into your colon so it can send that Clostridium difficile, which is the C. diff bacteria, back into a normal balance where it's no longer causing you harm. So essentially that disease is caused by the antibiotics, not by a bacteria. So since bacteria don't invade us and cause disease, they can't be contagious. But it is important to use some, hygienic procedures when you're working around dead animals, especially, right? So when you're preparing meat, for example, because if the meat has started to rot, it could have some of these toxins and you don't want to get exposed to those. So, make sure it's important to clean up after yourself and not, roll around in dead flesh, but you don't have to worry about being contagious for a bacterial related illness.
Hey, besides having credentials, both the authors and the doctor, I noticed that you have a common link that you both steer away from the petroleum-based medicines, because people don't. I have to imagine that all my subscribers that understand that the Rockefellers, the Rothschilds, all the elites have put their petroleum-based power into the medical field, and basically every single tablet, every single medicine, everything you're taking is petroleum-based, like what runs your vehicle. You guys both are firm. You guys are both firm believers in natural medicine.
Absolutely.
I mean, Dr. Kaufman, that's your entire thing, and you guys also cover this in your lengthy book.
Yeah.
Have you had there's a lot of questions on here. I know you technically can't answer them online without getting in trouble of some sort. But could somebody theoretically make it through their entire life simply living naturally? Because it doesn't exist in this world anymore.
Well, it's not theoretical, Richie. I mean, that would be the healthiest way to live your life.
Well, theoretically, I was trying to sound smart, and it came out. So you're gonna have to work with me, all right?
Absolutely. I mean, and that's really the basis of our book, is that natural is best. And both Dawn and I know Andy has a slightly different view, because I guess, and tell me if I'm wrong, Andy, you still eat meat, but we're both vegetarians and have been. Well, I've been vegetarian for over 45 years. So it gives a bit of a clue to my age. I'm probably older than I look. I don't know. But
he's 123, actually.
Sorry?
I said you're 123, right?
Well, I'm not far off. Yeah, I'm not far off. But no, I mean, we don't eat any meat, but and we don't take any medicines. We don't get ill. We don't have colds and flu and that sort of thing. So the natural life, both Dawn and I are living proof that you can live a natural life. You can eat healthily. I mean, we try to, ours is a plant-based diet, which is not boring, once you know how to do it. There's lots of variety. We try to eat as much organic food as possible, and there are good reasons for that. It's not commercial. As we explain in the book, with sort of factory farming as it is now, where most plants are grown in soils which are basically dead, naturally dead. So the plants and that are growing in chemicals. They rely on fertilizers, which are not natural fertilizers, they're chemical fertilizers. So there's a lot of the minerals that would normally be uptaken by the plants from the soil, which then are transferred to you when you eat them. It no longer happens anymore. So you can buy stuff from your supermarket, which looks great, but it doesn't necessarily have the nutritious content that you would normally get. So quite often people are deficient in certain minerals, and one of them is magnesium. But that doesn't mean that we're advocating lots of supplements. You just need to be aware of this, and make sure that your food balance takes that into account. There's lots of other things like nuts, as well as fruit and vegetables. Nuts are very rich in some of these minerals. Well, as I say, we've lived our life like that for many decades, and remain very healthy, and hopefully to go on a lot longer. So yes, natural is best. Mother Nature packages food with all its vitamins and minerals in the right way, which is most easy for the body to assimilate, which is not the case with many, if not all, manufactured multivitamins. Many of the components are not easily assimilated by the body, so they don't actually do any good, and some of them can do quite a bit of harm because they can throw the body out of kilter, as it were, and destroy the natural homeostasis of the body. So natural is best is an easy thing to do. We do explain this in the book as to why it is. It's not because we're natural advocates of vegetarianism and we don't sort of despise meat eaters or anything like that, but it's just our research has shown which is the most healthy way to live, and the most natural and least expensive. The natural way to live doesn't cost you any extra money. In fact, you can probably save yourself money. You'll certainly save yourself money in doctor's fees and ill health and over-the-counter medicines. So it's a win-win situation, really. I would like to just mention, because sorry to just jump in there, because antibiotics came up, and I think it's worth mentioning that because a lot of people think of antibiotics as sort of a wonder drug that's hailed by the medical establishment as some wonderful thing that's saved everyone's life over the years. But that's not true. I mean, as we've all pointed out, antibiotic means sort of anti-life. It's a killer, and it's designed to kill bacteria, which are the good guys in actual fact. But what it does do is, when it's ingested by the body quite rightly recognizes it as toxic, and so it wants to get rid of it as quickly as possible. So it fires up the endocrine system, which is a group of ductless glands in the body, controls hormones and things. It fires up the endocrine system to get that toxic out as quickly as possible. And in doing so, it sort of, whatever the original toxin was that was making you ill from something you've eaten or inhaled, gets washed out with it. But then the medical establishment claims the victory for antibiotics. But that's actually not the case when it's looked at. And what then tends to happen, and even the medical establishment is realizing this, overuse of antibiotics, if you can imagine, keep firing up, like if you did it with your car engine, you keep over-revving it all the time, you're going to cause damage. Well, if you keep over-revving the endocrine system by keep feeding it toxic antibiotics, you eventually burn it out. It doesn't work so well. And then you get all sorts of other illnesses and get set in as well. But the medical establishment just tell you that why the antibiotics are not working so well now is that because you've got superbugs that have developed resistance to them. But it's not that at all. It's just that they've wrecked your endocrine system, and so it can't do anything anymore, and people have quite serious illnesses leading on from that. I just thought I'd mention that because it's a big misnomer about antibiotics being sort of a cure-all for all bacterial problems, but in actual fact it's not at all. In fact, it causes more serious problems than it does actually clear things up.
Well, Andrew, being a doctor in the United States, that's blasphemy. I mean, antibiotics are the number one first thing that everyone gets, and they give them they'll give them weeks and weeks worth. You're telling me that this is bad for people?
Absolutely.
I already know the answer.
Richie, if you look at the amount of people that die from infectious disease from now and go back all the way in time to when antibiotics were first invented, you'll actually see that there's been no reduction in death from infectious disease since antibiotics were invented. So in other words, that's the real proof. If they were really so effective at treating infections, then we would have less people dying from infections since they were invented, but there's no evidence of that.
I like a little quote that I came across today, which amused me, but it's very true, where someone had said, if the germ theory was true, there'd be no one alive to believe in it. And I think there's quite a bit of truth in that. So, if the germ theory were true, there'd be no one left alive to believe in it. So, something to think about.
This is one that I wanted to ask you, and I was afraid I was going to forget, and somebody just jogged my memory. I can't find it, but the third leading cause of death in the world it's from people taking prescriptions. Is that accurate? Did I say that wrong?
Yeah, no, it's affectionately known as iatrogenesis, which is, if I'm going to be uncharitable, it means just death by modern medicine, really, death by the medical establishment. Yeah. There's been several studies done, particularly in America. I think the Starfield was one of them, which sort of looked at something like maybe 120,000 people a year in America alone die from this iatrogenesis, which is where the person is taking a prescription drug under the auspices of the medical establishment. They've taken it in the correct dose and in the correct way, and it's killed them. And 120,000 people roughly die of that every year in the States alone. And of course, you can multiply that out through every country in the Western world. Yeah, absolutely scandalous. And if the media was doing its job properly, they would be creating a big fuss about it. But as we know, they're complicit because, as you rightly say, they're controlled by the same people. So the public never get to hear the truth about these things.
Our government collects lots of statistics about health outcomes, right, and cause of death. And right now, they're basically telling us to record every death as a COVID-19 death. But one thing they do not track is they do not follow deaths due to healthcare. And in fact, they probably misreport most of these because they would, if you were, say, had a certain diagnosis that was serious and then you died related to healthcare, they would report it as a death related to that health condition, not to the healthcare. But there's the study that David mentioned where the 120 to 128,000 deaths from prescription drugs a year. But there's also a study from Johns Hopkins looking at what they call medical errors. And they estimated 250,000 people die a year in a year from medical errors, which doesn't include the prescription drugs. So if you add those two together, you get 378,000 deaths a year. And that definitely puts it into the third leading cause of death. But that's not really the end, because that doesn't include a lot of things. Like, it doesn't include deaths from vaccines. It doesn't include deaths from chemotherapy. So there have been other estimates based on looking at additional numbers that have been in the 700 to 1 million or 700,000 to 1 million death a year range. And that would put it as the first or second leading cause of death in the United States. So we're talking about a system that is contributing to be one of the top leading causes of death here, our healthcare system. And we're totally unaware of that. And, as David stated, the mainstream media do not really report on these studies, which they're readily available if you look for them, but you're not going to find out about them by watching the news or reading the newspaper. You have to know about them and then look for them yourself. But this is extremely serious. We're saying that healthcare is one of the leading causes of death. So what the heck are we doing with our system?
It's particularly bad in the US because they do actually have probably one of the main healthcare systems that do promote a lot of drug use, prescription drug use. So it may be slightly worse in the US. I don't know what it's like in every country around the world, but any country that uses that system that relies on pharmaceutical, modern medicine, pharmaceuticals, will have a similar problem.
Absolutely.
I find it strange that trying to find this, I tried to find this morning. I only had a couple of coffees in me, but I tried to find this morning where the third leading cause was what you were just talking about, and it's hard to find.
You're not going to find it, Richie, because this is something that they don't want you to know. So you have to take the studies together and combine them to come up with this analysis on your own.
Okay.
So I guess I should put out a paper on it so then you can reference that. But really, there are many people that have done this in various books, and I can give you the link to that. But no matter how you do it, it's really bad.
Well, yeah. What I was leading up to is that in this day and age, even if you did put a paper up, it would only take a matter of a week or so until it was removed or rearranged, because they're already doing that. You've got what all three of you just mentioned about the third leading cause of death. And now we're looking down the barrel of mandatory vaccines, 2 of them at a time, with some sort of a component in it that can literally track you from outer space or through the air or through unnatural means. That should be incredibly disconcerting to people. And for the majority, this entire thing has put 9 out of 10 people to sleep. They're walking around with their masks. They're not shaking hands. They're not hugging. They're not interacting with their loved ones. This was masterful. This was masterful. And if it was true, why would they be lying about every single number? You can't get real numbers out of anybody. They tell you 90,000 people have died worldwide in a 4-month, 5-month period. In the scheme of things, with billions of people on the earth, that's a good day medically, in my opinion. I mean, I'm not a doctor, but I know one.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
Well, I've been looking at the CDC data on a daily basis, right? And we don't have any more people dying this year compared to the average of the last 3 years. So that actually means it's not even the highest year in those 4 years, right? Because if we look at each individual year, we're going to be lower than at least one other year in the past 3 years. So if we have less people dying, then there's no evidence of any pandemic. So all of these measures that they're taking are completely for other reason, and it's about gaining control of us.
Well, here's one that I can't quite figure out. They're going to say, well, the reason that the death rates aren't out of control to actual pandemic proportions is because we engaged in social distancing. Everybody locked themselves in their houses, gloves, masks, etc. But meanwhile, the influenza rates from last year and this year remain the same. How do you explain that? You know what I mean? Like, how could they explain that? Because I know that's what they're going to say. Well, the reason it didn't go where people were dropping in the streets like birds falling from the sky is because we had everybody stay in their house and social distance. But how come that didn't affect the amount of people dying from the flu? Because the same as last year is the same as this year. Is the flu somehow smarter than COVID-19?
Of course, they're going to, say that the reason why we had fewer deaths, right, is because of the lockdown measures, right? And that's what they did in China to convince everyone else to adopt these. But the thing is, if there are no overall excessive deaths, right, that means not one person died of COVID, right? If we had everybody else this year died of all the normal things, but then because we have a new disease, then people who wouldn't die this year are going to be dying of this new disease, right? If that were true, then you'd have more deaths this year than last year. But we don't have it. In fact, we have slightly less, right? So there's no proof that one person died of a new disease, right? So there was no curve to flatten, is what I'm saying.
Yeah.
But the other thing is that the fact that everyone's been locked in their own houses and not seeing other people rather gives the lie to the idea that there are any infectious diseases, because nobody's spreading anything to anybody else. So there are no infectious diseases, and this proves it as well. So not even influenza, which we discussed before, that it's not a contagious disease, but they're just symptoms that people have from normal processes of the body kind of clearing out toxins and the cyclical kind of processes that help the body to restore health, remain healthy. So yes, it just shows there are no infectious diseases because everyone's been keeping away from each other.
And yet the experience in the UK, Andy, is the same as the States. There's no real increase in deaths. So again, it gives a lie to the fact that there's extra people dying from this dreaded disease sweeping the world. Just there's no evidence to support it, even in their own figures. So crazy. But I don't know why more people don't see it, and that I find very dismaying that people are asleep, and I know lots of people, I'm sure you do too.
Yep.
And they just are asleep, and they don't take kindly to you trying to point a few facts out even, which is very sad.
There are so many barriers for some of those people to wake up that it's too difficult. And I think it's important to, just recognize that they're not open to it, and to try to have compassion for them, because as these measures roll out, they're going to be the ones who are harmed the most, right? Because they're going to be the first volunteers for the vaccine, and whatever the consequences of that, they're going to be suffering. They're going to be the first ones to volunteer for contact tracing. They're going to be the first ones to be pulled out of their home and put into some designated quarantine site. So I think about those things, and I have compassion for those people. But on the other hand, I have seen a lot of people who have been waking up. Some of them have been reaching out to me. I see more people every day. And I think there's a lot of people also who are waking up, but they're afraid to go out and tell people about it, because they don't want to be ostracized, and they don't want to be ridiculed or peer pressured. And I really wish these people would become a little bit more courageous, because the risk of not coming out publicly is getting to be much bigger than the risk of coming out and talking about this. And so it's really important, and I'm hopeful that as things get pushed a little bit harder, that these people are going to find the courage and decide to stand up, because, you know, how can you subject yourself to this tyranny when you know that there is no justification for it whatsoever? And even if there was a real illness, shouldn't it be up to us as individuals if we want to put ourselves at risk or not?
Yeah, I mean, as you say, and as many people have pointed out, you know, even if this were a real virus it's not been shown to be any worse than normal flu, and we certainly don't lock the world down every time people are supposedly getting the flu, so it's totally over the top. I don't know whether it's happened in the States, but just worth pointing out that in the UK there's a legal company in London, Wedlake Bell, who have and it's been a crowd-funded thing here. People have put together money to the sum of approaching about £130,000 to put a legal action against the UK government to show that what they've done is not only illegal, it's also unconstitutional and unscientific. They've not gone as far as we would like, but I have read the 20-page document that the legal eagles have put to the government, and you know, they have a good case, you know, with my limited knowledge of legal procedures, but you know, it's been put forward by a large legal company, and they've got a Queen's Counsellor, you know, so this is really high-powered legal person who's putting this to the government, so he's obviously sure of his ground. And reading through their 20-page document, it all makes sense to me, you know, that, as I say, the government has acted illegally and against our constitution. So that's ongoing at the moment. Now, I'd like to see more of that, and I hope it's going to happen in every country. What I'd like to see added onto that is that someone takes up the cudgels as far as the scientific point of view and puts to the government, to the authorities, you know, the questions for them to prove that this virus exists, you know, with the three little questions that we mentioned earlier on in this, and are in our book, if people have forgotten what they are, which I wouldn't be surprised, but they're in there. Now, someone could put that to the government and say, well, you lock the world down, you're going to have to prove what you say. It's not an unreasonable thing, surely, to say, prove that this virus exists and that it is the cause of this disease. But no one's done that. And I find that quite surprising. But if at least now some people are starting to challenge the government legally, I hope that someone will do this scientifically as well.
Well, the rumor has it, I believe it's one state, I think it's Wisconsin or Michigan, the Supreme Court overturned all of this lockdown stuff after 2 months. I haven't checked in on it as of yet today to see what's going on with it, but this entire thing was criminal. And it was a worldwide criminal act. When they keep showing you the billboards that say, we're all in this together, that's basically them saying, we're all in this together against you. Basically, that's what I see.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. And it is sickening, you know, when these creepy people say those sorts of things, you know, when you know it's them that's causing this problem. And I would like to see a day of reckoning. And I'm not talking about violence here.
Right.
I'm just talking about these people being exposed for the liars that they are, and you know, and at least taken away from office, if nothing else. And the people will never believe a word they say ever again. I would like to see that happen. And I'm optimistic.
People have bought it hook, line, and sinker in the States, though. I mean, it's amazing. And it was brilliant to lock everyone in their house. They're sitting there watching nothing but mainstream fear porn, telling them, are you having a difficult time breathing? And they're giving them all the symptoms repetitively over and over. And some people will actually, I mean, television's a weapon. It wasn't there for entertainment. It was there to guide the population. So it was a pretty well done, because it's still going on to this very moment.
Yeah,
and there've been plenty of sort of films giving out the propaganda over the last few years or decades or whatever, I can't remember all of them, but, with names like Contagion and Epidemic. No, it wasn't Epidemic, it was something else. But, it's social conditioning, getting people ready for this kind of thing. So when it happens, everyone's like really scared. And that's one of the things that we're trying to do, is to take the fear away and say there is nothing to be scared of. There isn't a virus that you need to be scared of. And hopefully that more and more people realise that and start looking at what's actually happening. But it can be a bit of an uphill struggle. But we are, again, seeing, like with Andy said, we are seeing more people starting to look at it and starting to say, yeah, no, I've looked at it, and because it is so massive what they've been doing, that it has made people it stunned people into actually questioning things for the first time, possibly. So we think it's good in a way, because it's actually giving us the opportunity, but everyone's got to realise it's an opportunity to maintain our freedoms.
Well, it's a very important turning point. I mean, it's. It could go either way at the moment, as you say, because the majority of people are just falling into the trap without thinking about it, and are not realising that if they don't do something now, even in any little way that they can push back against these ridiculous rules, if they don't do something now, they'll lose the opportunity to ever do it. I do want to make another point. I know we've not talked about it, but it's one of the videos that's been doing the rounds that I see and has got lots of views, and that's the Plandemic video with Judy Mikovits, and we did watch that, and some interesting things to come out of it. I won't sort of labour it too much, but it's videos like that cause a lot of damage and confusion, because
we're on the same page. I was hoping you were going to say that. I'm like, please don't wrap this up by endorsing that, because I've used a couple of sound bites from Dr. Mikovits, because she straight up said things like, you can only get a virus if it's injected, and that was gold.
Yeah. But
now the pandemic thing, I'm not buying it. It's disinformation. But go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, I'm glad you said that. I mean, I've got used to just going ahead anyway, but I come up against resistance everywhere. But no, I'm glad you agree with it. I found it very disappointing and somewhat annoying that Judy Mikovits said the things that she did, but she's sort of shot herself in the foot, because one is, she's in that video, she said that she was on the team that isolated HIV, which we know is totally untrue, and we know that in a subsequent video with David Crow.
Oh, it was an interview with David Crow on the Infectious Myth, yes.
Yeah, she admitted that wasn't true, or she said that she didn't. So that's a lie, and quite an important one too. And we just know that no one's isolated a virus for HIV. No one has done it. So we knew that was untrue anyway. But then she also made in that an amazing statement where she said she taught the Ebola virus to infect people, which I just thought was amazingly stupid thing to say. I have to say, that's why would you do it even if you could, and which is an impossible thing to do. But this is the sort of thing she was putting out, and of course she's a virologist, so she believes that viruses infect people anyway, which again is an unfounded science. So she believes viruses are pathogens.
But she develops vaccines, so that might give you a clue.
But she's hailed by many people as being some sort of hero, and yet she's making completely untrue and contradictory statements, which is going to lead a lot of people astray. And it's unfortunate that the video has been sort of so widespread, and it's one of those dangerous things. And I start to question what the reason is behind Judy Mikovits. What is she's doing? I know some people might say maybe she's controlled opposition. I'm sure you're familiar with that term.
Indeed.
And I think that could well be true. So I just thought I'd mention that because it's quite popular in doing the rounds at the moment.
Dr. Kaufman, question. I know you were out of the room for a moment.
Yeah, well, I have a few things to say. One is glad that there are some lawsuits coming forward, but I don't think that that's really the solution, because I don't trust that the court system is going to uphold any justice. And in my personal life, I've been involved in many court cases as an expert witness, and I haven't really seen justice be at the top of the priority list. So I think the way to go is that we simply decide that we are not following these mandates, and we're going to uphold our own inalienable freedoms and rights, and we should go out there and behave as we normally do. And I think that's the way to change this situation, that if we ask for permission or approval from the government authorities, it will not be forthcoming, and it also shows our willingness to comply with whatever they ask of us.
I agree with you entirely. I mean, I often say, and your country is the same as ours, we have a legal system, we don't have a justice system. They are two different things. And like you, we've seen miscarriages of justice, if you like. And we have to remember, the judicial system, certainly in the UK, I'm sure it's the same in America, they're part of the establishment. Judges are appointed by the government. So, where are their allegiances going to be? They're going to be to the government. You're not necessarily going to get justice, but at least it's a sign of someone trying to do something to bring into question what the government's done, which is totally illegal. So if nothing else, it might wake a few people up if they see that there's government action. But again, even though this is quite a major thing when a law firm takes the government to task, and yet over here, the British Broadcasting Corporation, you don't see anything about it, and it's not a major issue. You don't really see it in any of the newspapers. And again, that's got to tell you something, and it certainly shows you how complicit the mainstream media is in just keeping this knowledge from people. I think it would be very surprising for the majority of people, and would help wake some up if they realised that a major law firm in London was taking the government to task for acting illegally. That alone ought to shake a few people up. But of course, for that reason, it doesn't get reported in the mainstream media.
Absolutely. Well, the mainstream media is essentially an intelligence operation, so they're not going to, work in our favor in any way. And also, I think you were talking a little bit about some other medical experts and some of the things they're saying, and I don't know if you touched on this, but I'm very concerned about this claim of some kind of manufactured biological weapon.
Yes.
Because, one is that I'm sure the government is putting research in trying to develop such things, right? But there's absolutely no evidence of anything deployed in this situation, because if it were, then we would see people, who are ill and dying from it. And I think that it's very dangerous to talk about some such thing being out there, because one is, if you were scared of a wild virus and you believed in that, well, then an engineered, weaponized virus is much, much scarier. So this is basically a way to keep people afraid and perpetuate the fear. And then, of course, it keeps the same dogma about viruses alive,
exactly.
right? That there are viruses that can cause disease. Now, if the government wanted to create illness, it would be simple. They could simply poison us. And there are many ways they could do this. They could put it in the water supply. They could spray it in the air, right? I mean, this has been done in other wars, right? Like, think about Agent Orange. Yeah. So, there are plenty of mechanisms that are already available technologically to make people sick. They don't need to go to this length to try to create a new synthetic type of organism that doesn't exist in nature that makes people sick. I mean, it doesn't make sense that you would even go that route. So really the most important thing is that there's simply no evidence that there are viruses that cause disease, whether they're manufactured by a military scientist or whether in nature. There's just no evidence of it. So any arguments based on that are false.
We agree entirely. You can't make a biological weapon out of something that isn't alive. We'd be the first to agree that the military create chemical weapons, but that's a different kettle of fish altogether. But I think these are just more stories, if you like, it's the old divide and conquer rules, which governments do all the time. They get lots of people arguing against one another. Oh, it's this or it's that, but the one thing that they never talk about is the truth. And
That's right. That's right, because they notice some people realizing that there's not a serious health problem. And so they want to give them something else to be scared about, right? And a weaponized superbug is definitely that thing, right?
Yeah.
But it's just a distraction. And,
yes.
And it's a very dangerous one.
The beauty part about all this is they have just proven emphatically they don't need to make any type of a bioweapon. All they have to use is the mainstream media. And yes, granted, people are waking up, but the majority will go along with whatever they say. They will take the vaccines. They'll take the loss of freedoms. They'll take the loss of their businesses. And in many cases, Dr. Kaufman and I were talking about this before we went live. They're saying that if they find out that you're positive for COVID-19, they can take your children. I've been getting that from everybody that's in the welfare system, the Social Security system. They're all getting notices saying that that's on the schedule. They're going to start taking children away for their own safety, of course. I mean, this is getting insane. They scared people with a story. The facts, the numbers, the deaths, nothing lines up, and it's still going. Yeah. It's amazing to me.
I mean, I think, yes, and I think it's not to buy into anything they do. We've sort of come across people where, as you say, they're putting out this test, want everyone to at least have the test, they're holding back the vaccine, but that'll be next in line, but have the test. But in the same thing, very similar to what happened with HIV and AIDS, there was a test, which has been, I know Andy knows this too, and we know this. The tests were completely nonsense, but gave lots of false positives. And then people were then dragged into a regime of very toxic medicine, AZT and other things like that, which certainly in the early days killed everyone that took it, as in such high dose. Now, we've got a similar thing happening here. They put a test out, they want everyone to have it, and they're going to probably get lots of false positives from it. But once you've had a test, then they've got a hold on you, because then they can say, well, you've tested positive, we've got to do this, that, and the other, and you're in the trap. So the only way to do it is resist anything to do with it, resist having any tests, certainly resist having any vaccinations, and try and stay out of the system as much as you can. Because that first little step, and I've heard people say this, well, it's only a test, it's going to show whether we're okay or not. Just don't do it, because you've already stepped into the trap if you do.
Well, this test, it's not that you're going to get a false positive. It's like every positive is a false positive because there's no disease that it's measuring. Right. So every single time this test is positive, it's false.
Yeah.
Right. The accuracy rate is 0%.
Yeah.
Because we don't even know what's measuring.
Exactly. I mean, the UK government's, sorry, Andy, the UK government's just decided to buy another testing kit from some Swiss company, I can't remember the name. Although they'd already bought 3 million test kits previously, God knows how much that's cost the taxpayer, but have now admitted that those test kits weren't any good. That's not what they said at the time, but now they're saying it, so they're spending a load more of taxpayers' money to buy a load more of different test kits. Right. I guess it's just until they get one that they've paid enough money for, and then they believe it works okay. But none of it, as I say, there's no science behind it, and people are best staying away from it entirely. But yes, you're absolutely right. There can be no positive results come from it because there's nothing to be positive about. Yeah.
Imagine a scenario playing out on Earth right now that would put the four of us in the same chat at 9 o'clock in the morning in the United States talking about this. I mean, this is absolutely unbelievable. It's unbelievable the amount of people, like there's no certain specific slice of society that's awake or aren't awake. Do you know what I'm saying? Dr. Kaufman and I couldn't be any more unalike, as well as Don and David, but we're all on the same exact page here. And has anybody noticed that ever since this pandemic has broken out, terrorism, shootings, all the other horror stories that fill the news every single day, they'd come to a complete and total halt, a grinding halt, I might include. So apparently terrorists that were going to blow themselves up to go to paradise, well, they were going to do that, but they don't want to get COVID.
Yeah.
I mean, it's amazing. And that was
isolating.
That was my answer to what would happen if people tried to go after the government. They would just push back in their brute force kind of way. But it's time.
Yeah.
It's time, because we're going down a really bad path, and the path seems to be getting shorter and shorter. And the time, it's Operation Time Warp or Space Warp or whatever it is, We're living in some crazy times.
It is crazy, dangerous, and scary. Not from, I should hasten to add, not scary from any virus point of view. The thing that to be afraid of is the government, the authorities, with these draconian measures they're taking. And I'm not trying to be pessimistic here. I mean, I'm ever the optimist, and I'm hoping that human nature will kick in, and their natural resistance to the BS that we're being fed will push back, even if it's in little ways. If they refuse to wear masks, if they refuse to have any tests, if they stop lining up in 2 meter distances between one another, because it's just craziness, and there is no scientific basis for any of that. Even if there were a real virus around that was a pathogen, there's no scientific basis that always walking 2 meters away from someone is going to give you any protection whatsoever. So people just need to just do a little bit of homework, and they can see that they're being conned, that this is just nonsense. But until they start doing that, and until they start pushing back in these little ways, they're lost. And that's a real tragedy.
All right, guys, we are at almost 2 hours right here. Unless somebody's got something very pressing they want to say, I think we're going to shut this down.
Just pass me the book. I like to try, and I did this the other day, and it was something that I think sums this whole thing up nicely. This I'll get it right. This is the book, but on the back of it we put a quote from Voltaire. 17th century, I think.
I stole that quote and put it on Twitter as though it was my own idea the other day. Honestly, I did.
You're welcome to it, but I think it just sums up all what we've been talking about, really. And that is, he said, doctors are men who prescribe medicines of which they know little, to cure diseases of which they know less, in human beings of whom they know nothing. And I think that sums up the whole situation, really, with the medical establishment.
Let me ask you, Dr. Kaufman, if you had input when they were researching this book, is there anything you would have changed in this or added to it, perhaps?
I really don't think so. And they, in reading that book, comparing it with my own research, they found many things that I have not come across yet. And so I think they did an excellent job. I'm sure they would have had a chapter on COVID-19 if they had been writing it now. But aside from that, I think it's just a wonderful reference.
But
thank you,
the timing, the research into the book, everything about the book, and the timing of when it was released and when this hit, I mean, that's far beyond coincidental. And one more time, I want to thank Crow 777, because Crow 777 is where I heard Dr. David Parker and Don Lester, and also where I heard Andrew Kaufman. So I stole them both. Thank you, Crow. It is what it is. But I mean, he got some great information out there right off the bat, and it continues to be germane right now. So it's amazing. Okay. This continues.
Okay. Well, thank you for your kind words, both of you. And
anytime at all. And links to everything will be in the description. Go ahead, Dr.
Thanks for reuniting us, because we had another talk about this before, but it's been taken down off many places. So it's great to be together again, Dawn and David, talking about this germ theory topic.
Absolutely.
Well, we're going to put it up on various platforms, and I'll send you guys the links to those as well. There's smaller platforms, but we got to do what we got to do. So
sure.
Yeah,
sure. Absolutely.
Okay.
All right, guys. We got 4,000 people watching live. I appreciate everybody, even the trolls. Everyone's got to do their job. Dr. Andrew Kaufman, his links will be posted in the description. David Parker, Don Lester, where you can buy the book, as well as their website, will be posted in the description. Richie from Boston, and we are out.